Monsieur le Président.
Chairman, honourable members of the European Parliament, ladies and gentlemen. We chose to express ourselves in French in that we are discussing legal issues and we would wish to be precise. Your Parliament last May commissioned a study on permanent structured cooperation, PESCO, to see what the state of play was between member states, to understand if there was a common understanding of the subject and if all the issues that should be dealt with in discussions had in fact been so. Mr. Santopinto and myself, on behalf of group, the Research and Information Group for Peace and Security, conducted that study and gave a report on it last June. Since last June, things have changed, the situation has evolved, but we feel that most of our conclusions are still viable, and we have three series of comments we'd like to make. First of all, there is a common understanding amongst the member states of what PESCO constitutes, but unfortunately that common understanding is a long way from the initial vision of the drafters of the Lisbon Treaty. Secondly, positions haven't fully converged yet amongst member states in spite of this common understanding, particularly amongst the French and Germans. And unfortunately, it's likely that understanding will coalesce around the lowest common denominator. Thirdly, there have been numerous debates that haven't taken place, that should have done, and which may crop up later in the day if it is actually decided to establish, which is the word used in the treaty, permanent structured cooperation. So I would like to start by looking at the common understanding that has been reached. And what we did was we asked our interlocutors three questions. Why do you want PESCO? What is PESCO? And finally, how can we implement PESCO? On the question of why should we have PESCO, I would say expectations have increased. The initial goal for PESCO was to set up autonomous military capability whereby the Union could manage, without the help of the Americans, hence autonomous, crises happening in Europe's neighbourhood which would have a direct or indirect effect upon her. And around the year 2000, the main European leaders found that they could not intervene in the crisis in Yugoslavia and didn't want that situation to repeat itself. So the initial goal of PESCO was to ensure that there would be autonomous military capability. You need to be clear. There are two different things. You have PESD, which is autonomous military capability and its use. That's the policy. And then there's how you build up that autonomous capability, and that is where PESCO comes in. And had one had that military autonomous capability, then the EU could have intervened in crises such as Mali, Libya or Syria before they degenerated into civil war. Today, the goal assigned to PESCO, which has been repeated on various occasions in Council's conclusions last spring, is to ensure that we can achieve the level of ambition that is a part of our global strategy. In other terms, we want not just to have autonomous military capability to be able to manage crises outside of the EU, but also to help to build up the military capability of the Union's partners, and in particular to allow for the protection of the Union and its citizens, both within and without our borders. In other words, the level of ambition has been significantly increased. Secondly, on the question of what PESCO is, the common understanding has evolved considerably. Initially, one of the key notions of PESCO was that it be avant-garde. In other words, it would allow those that wanted to make faster progress to do so by forming a coalition of the willing and those that were in a position to be willing. Today, we are moving more towards the notion of inclusiveness. Only France seems to want to push to have an ambitious PESCO, something which could be used for something else, whereas all of the other member states behind Germany want PESCO to be inclusive. Now, we can understand the reasons why European unity is seen to be so important and people would wish to be grouped together. However, the notion of inclusiveness is incompatible with that of it being an avant-garde concept. Because if one is to be inclusive, then again, you're likely to be working at the lowest common denominator, with people being less ambitious about what they wish to do. Then the third point, there are larger differences of opinion on how PESCO should be implemented. Initially, the idea was that there would be 5 series of binding commitments on the financing of military equipment, the planning of defence, on the making availability of operational capability, overcoming capability gaps, and ensuring participation in major European equipment programs through the European Defence Agency. If I were to sum up PESCO in just one word, I would actually say it's a process. It's a process of integration. If we want to have a mental image of what PESCO is, you should think about a Greek temple where the frontispiece would be the autonomous capability that we mentioned, and where the only way to actually build a balanced frontispiece is to ensure that all of the columns are placed in the right position, all the same depth, height and width. That's what PESCO is. In more concrete terms, I would call on you to have a look at what the Belgians and the Netherlands have done in terms of naval cooperation, because that's very much the spirit of PESCO. What have they done? Together, they planned to renew their fleets. They decided to build minesweepers and frigates, and one country took the lead on one project, the other on the other. They built those vessels and they operate them together, they support them together. The crews receive the same training and they can also learn the same lessons from their joint commitments. That is what PESCO should be. And integration, a process of integration, is the important point there. What is happening today? Today, we should be clear, really, no member state wants to talk about integration, to such a point that the very idea of integration has been replaced by the concept of modularity, which came from nowhere, at least not from the treaties. What does modularity mean? It means that the member states will not be forced to be involved in all of the projects, but can be involved on a modular basis. In other words, voluntary. In other words, they commit themselves to committing. To what? On what? How? All of that remains to be determined. Modularity, therefore, is the new word being used for cooperation. The problem is that we've had cooperation in defence in Europe for 20 years now, so we are a very long way from the initial visions of those that drafted the treaty. And what we are currently seeing is a light PESCO, PESCO light. Moving on to the second series of observations on various countries' different positions, here one can distinguish 5 different groups of member states. First of all, there's the Franco-German core. It will be a secret for no one that once the UK has left the European Union, then without Germany, without France, European defence would make no sense at all. Quite simply because those 2 countries are the critical mass in terms of financing, defence research, military capability, operational capability. And the other defence structures would then surround those. Without either of those two countries, France or Germany, the critical mass would not be achieved. The problem is that actually it's the French and Germans who disagree the most amongst themselves. I think the whole question of inclusiveness as opposed to level of ambition is really not the issue. PESCO can be both ambitious and inclusive if it's considered not as a framework but as a process. If it's a framework, in other words, something that you see around a photo or a painting, then everybody will want to be in the photo and you'll never get anywhere. If it's a process, there's a starting point and an end point. The starting point doesn't need to be very ambitious. The important point is to decide on the starting point. What kind of peaks do we want to be able to reach? 200 meters, 400 meters, 1400 meters. And then on the means as well that will be used and the timetable for climbing that peak. Now, if we can trust in the fact that at the end of the day the French and the Germans will reach a compromise, we do feel though that neither the French nor the Germans are really planning to get rid of their defence structures. So what are they doing? Under the pressure of their political leaders, in Germany, Chancellor Merkel, and in France, President Macron, what they're trying to do is to do what they've always done. In other words, to fill in the cooperation basket, the PESCO basket, with as many projects as possible, as if they were going on a kind of Easter egg hunt. The latest news is that there will be 36 projects, so it's business as usual, in other words. We are only continuing with cooperation, and I see nothing being planned at the moment that is anything close to integration. And without integration, which is a taboo word, none of this means anything. The second group of countries around the central core are the volunteer states. In other words, all of these that are part of this group don't necessarily have the means to be a part of it, but for various reasons, some of them are founding member states. They can't imagine not being a part of this. Italy, for example. Then there's Spain as well, that provides an important contribution when it comes to defence, and then of course the Benelux countries too, who nonetheless it would seem hesitated a great deal about participating in PESCO. In this group you also have Finland, which is not part of NATO and therefore sees European defence as being particularly important. There's also Estonia and Latvia, who are very much involved in this initiative. And then also there are countries such as the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary who see PESCO without a doubt of involving a means of involving Europe vis-à-vis the eastern border, and Greece for similar reasons vis-à-vis Turkey. And then we've got a third group who we say are resigned to PESCO, who didn't want to join PESCO but did so to avoid being relegated to second class, and that would be Lithuania, Bulgaria and Romania. And then there was a fourth group, the undecided, Sweden and Portugal. It would seem that since then those two countries have now come into the camp of those that won't be a part of PESCO. The fifth group of four countries, Austria and Ireland, for reasons that have to do with their neutrality, Malta that has no army, and obviously the UK. So we will therefore have a PESCO which is very heterogeneous. We were talking in the summer about a group of 18 to 24 countries. In Tallinn we were talking about 20 member states, but in reality everything does depend about what will happen with the Franco-German agreement, which will depend in its turn upon what the new German government will wish to do. Then final series of comments. There are debates that have not been commented on or have not taken place. Firstly, the whole question of governance. the governance of PESCO and PESD is something that's going to be very complicated and run at 4 levels. First of all, there's the level of the CSDP, which is regulated in Council. In other words, what do we do with our autonomous capability? And there, decisions have to be taken unanimously. The second level is PESCO itself. In other words, what will be done to obtain that capability? And again, everything is done within Council, but only the member states that are involved in PESCO will vote. And again, the vote has to be unanimous. Then, I should say in passing, that this was the most astute and simple means found by the treaty to actually achieve this famous notion of inclusiveness, because debates on PESCO will take place in Council. Even if not all of the members are voting, all of the members will be informed. Then the third level of governance.
Donc, le troisième niveau qu'on oublie toujours.
The third level, which we tend to overlook, is the European Development Agency level. That's supposed to play, or the European Defence Agency rather, that's supposed to play a dual role. On the one hand, it's supposed to assess commitments, but it's also to oversee major equipment furnishing programs. And lastly, the final level of governance is the one of the programs or projects themselves, and governance there is dependent on, or is set on a case-by-case basis. Now that's quite complex, but at that point everything is also decided upon in unanimity, and that requires an awful lot of effort. The second debate that's been glossed over is the necessary reform of the European Defence Agency. If the European Defence Agency is to carry out the role which it's supposed to in PESCO under the treaties, then it would be important to change its governance structure. That would be to move to a qualified majority, as is set out in its statute. So there's nothing to prevent that from happening. We need the critical mass there of expertise for major equipment furnishing programs, and this could be and the thing there to do is to speed up the merger of the OCA, the Organisation for Joint Armament Cooperation. The third debate, which has been glossed over, is the coherence between the Commission's initiatives. So here, the European Fund for Defence and that of the Council, the PESCO and the CARD. Now, this is work which is ongoing, but sooner or later the relationship between these different instruments has to be sorted out. And the fourth debate, which has been overlooked or glossed over, is the impact of Brexit on PESCO. Now, legally speaking, things are quite similar, quite simple. Once the UK leaves the Union, it won't be able to be part of PESCO. But politically, things are very different. No member states want the British to leave, and if we believe what the British say, they don't want to go too far in leaving either. But the way that the Union and the United Kingdom will maintain their defence links remains to be seen. And lastly, let's not forget, if PESCO was to be a success, i.e. it was to reflect what those who wrote the treaty wanted to do, then that would lead us to re-examine the relationship between PESCO and NATO, and that of course would be a tall order. I've finished what I was going to say, and I now hand over to my colleague Federico Santopinto to conclude